everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Hurricane U. This is the December 2024 edition. Always good to talk to my friend, Dr. Phil Klotzbach. Got some questions for him regarding the 2024 season and where we go from here, especially at the end of my line of questioning. I got a couple that are kind of bothering me that I want to run past him. So, Phil, first of all, welcome. Glad to have you back with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. Always great to chat with you.
Well, thank you. Let's get right to it. Made some notes because I wanted to be pretty concise this time. I got some very specific stuff. As best you can answer in the short time that we have during the down period of the 2024 season, um, have we figured out? We know what happened. Why did it happen?
Yeah, so I think, the unfortunately the answer isn't just one thing. I think there were a few different things. There were different things during. So there was basically from about August 20th to September 23rd, which is right prior to when Helene formed, we had the least activity by a wind energy metric since 1994. So I mean, extremely quiet, and everybody, our group at CSU, were one that said, "Oh, it's going to be a super busy season," and everyone was like, "What the heck just happened?" And so I think there were a few things that happened during the latter part of August. So these African easterly waves, which are your kind of your building blocks for hurricanes, these strong thunderstorm complexes, for about 2 weeks they shifted very far to the north. So instead of coming off at the latitudes of about Senegal, they came off in northern Mauritania, even Western Sahara. And when storms come off that far north, basically the waters off the coast of Africa at that latitude are very cold. Also, as you may remember, Western Sahara dust, dry air, that really kind of knocks stuff down in late August when overall subseasonal conditions overall should have been extremely conducive for storms to form. Then when the waves kind of shifted back further to the south, those waves that came off really far north brought all this dry air into the tropics, so that kind of suppressed stuff. We also, while vertical wind shear, that change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere, was generally very, very low for most of the season, it did have a brief increase around the early to middle part of September. And so things kind of, so I think really early on it was the waves going too far north, and after that it was too much dust, or sorry, not too much dust, too much dry air and too much shear. But then really, September 23rd, September 24th, when Helene formed, basically it was like a switch flipped and went from extremely quiet to extremely busy right away. And then obviously we had a really big flurry of activity. And even with really knocking down storm activity at the peak of the season, we still ended up meeting NOAA's definition of a hyperactive season.
Was there anything in the climate models that you can go back and look through and say, oh, there was a hint of that there, and then maybe somehow plan for that if there's a way to do so for the future? Because you want people to believe the science. And when you get those periods of time like that, we all saw it, the doubters come out, and that's hard to deal with. I know it is. It's got to be because this has been going on, these forecasts since the mid 80s. Colorado State, I think, has the best reputation. And when something like that happens, it is hard. So trying to ward that off in the future, were there clues that maybe could be factored in to try to mitigate that in the future?
I mean, it's interesting because at the end of the day, if you look at the overall numbers and of what we predicted versus observed for hurricanes and major hurricanes, it was pretty much spot
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
So,
true.
and it was weird. Obviously, had we had the season just completely ended up dead the rest of the season, then obviously we take a different look at it. I think there's maybe some stuff. I'm not sure necessarily we could have anticipated the lull in, say, June or July, but I like to think with the early August forecast, since it was only like 2 weeks away, like
Yeah.
you should be able to anticipate it. And there was some stuff in some of the subseasonal forecast models that was hinting at maybe a quieter thing, but those subseasonal models 3 to 4 weeks out don't have a ton of skill historically, so it's been a little bit hard. But I do think one of the things that may have kind of tipped us off was normally dust tends to kind of go along with shear. And so June and July, the shear was low, but the dust was really high.
Mm.
And when there's a lot of dust, that can apparently excite kind of the northerly track for these easterly waves. And so that may have been something I think not necessarily we could look at in June, but certainly with the August forecast. If for some reason everything's pointing gangbuster season like it was for this 2024 season, but there's a ton of dust, maybe then, knock down the numbers. Because overall, the number of hurricanes and major hurricanes, I think, was very close or spot on, depending on the forecast. But we were too high on the number of storms, or we were too low on, no, sorry, we were too high in the number of storms. There were fewer than observed. or fewer. We predicted more than we got, and then
Right.
also accumulated cyclone energy. We were too high, so we didn't have as many long track major hurricanes because ACE is basically a metric that accounts for storm frequency, intensity, or sorry, storm intensity and duration. And we just didn't have the long track storms. So, overall, the seasonal forecast was not the colossal bust that how we talked in the middle of September we may have thought would happen, but certainly it would have been very good to be able to anticipate, that we were going to have a lull, because the April and June forecast actually verified quite well. The August forecast not as well, and the August forecast should be the one that's the best because it's closest to the season. So that didn't make me real happy.
But it helps you learn, like
Oh, sure. Yeah.
is
Yeah. And frankly, I feel better learning about the season now, given overall the numbers ended up being relatively close, as opposed to obviously if have we ended the season with a below normal season, then we'd really, really be having to take a really hard look at things. But there's certainly, we do have some ideas of things we're going to be trying to do to better encapsulate some of the uncertainty that we have with the seasonal forecast. We already do some stuff to try to make that more robust. And we're obviously always looking for, new predictors and other things. So I think
right.
we're working right now on a paper on the lull of the season, like why it was there, because while I gave you some answers today of what I think was going on, we don't necessarily have all the answers yet. So
Yeah,
I want to try
sure.
to dig into it in more detail and try to figure out, if there was anything else that was there. And also, obviously, my biggest question is, can we predict it? Because, if
Right.
if we can't, that's okay, but it'd be really nice if we could.
Sure. Agreed. So one thing that I think is striking, and I didn't do a lot of research into this because I think I know it off the top of my head. Correct me if I'm wrong. We have not had a Category 3 or higher hurricane make landfall on the east coast of the United States in over 20 years, and the last one was Gene in 2004. Is that right?
Let me do a quick run through. Dun, 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 dun. Um,
Saffir-Simpson scale, obviously
I'm just
major
thinking.
problem. I just don't
Yeah,
think
I believe you are correct.
that's
Yeah,
a
so
long
obviously like
time. Have you
Irma,
thought
Irma
about
was close. It kind of went up through the middle keys. But yes, if you don't say Irma was a major landfall, then yes. We've had hurricane landfalls, but not a category 3 plus. And so, you know, I mean, some of it's obviously a little bit of it's dumb luck because
was
obviously
getting at?
Irma.
Like, what is the deal? Like, that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, obviously, you know, I think a little bit of it's luck. We've had some very close calls. Obviously, you think about a storm like Dorian, a storm like Matthew,
Right.
very, very, very close to the east coast of the US. So it would be hard. It's not like, oh, there was some massive thing that kept that from making landfall. That was just, a
Understood.
slight shift in a ridge or
Agreed.
a trough, and that's on shore.
Right.
But, one of the things we've had, we've had several years, we've had a pretty robust trough along the East Coast that has caused storms to recurve. And in general, the last few years, we've had a lot more. The Gulf has just been busy, a lot more stuff in the Western Atlantic. La Nina tends to favor stuff moving a little bit farther to the west. Also tends to really favor storm formations in the Caribbean, even up into the Gulf of Mexico. And we've generally been trending more towards La Nina. So I would say, the primary answer is why we've had 0 versus 1 or 2 is just dumb luck. But then also
But
there's
20
been a few
years is
other
a pretty
things that
good
have been.
stretch.
What was
20
that?
years.
Yeah, it
Wow.
is. It is a good stretch. But I mean, like we look at landfalls, and when you start getting into these games of like very small statistics, you look at Florida. Florida had, if you account, I know Ivan was officially in Alabama, but basically 7 hurricanes in 2 years, in '04 and '05, and
Right.
then 10 years with not one. And then
Right.
since then, there's been tons. So it's one of those things where you start looking, and when you get to a smaller and smaller region, that you can start to kind of have these, you can start to kind of maybe make inferences on patterns that may or may not be there. Because obviously, again,
Right.
Irma, Matthew, and Dorian were all very close. Depending on exactly how you define the East Coast, we're all very, I mean, especially Matthew was,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know,
I
his
was,
closest point was probably like 50 miles offshore or something. So very,
I mean,
very
I think it
close.
was closer than that. I think because I was in New Smyrna Beach for it, and I was in the Western Core, and I mean, I was thinking, boy, just 20 miles to my east, that's
Yeah,
the eye.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. Because I know Cape Canaveral, the like one of the stations out of Cape Canaveral had like 105 mile an hour wind because it got really dang close. So obviously that storm 50 miles farther west would have
Right.
been,
And
epic. But
look,
yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since the east coast of Florida has really, definitely they've had impacts, but a lot of those impacts have actually been from storms coming in on the west coast and then crossing
right.
the state. So
Well, and two, we're talking Saffir-Simpson scale stuff here. We have had major impacts. Matthew, Florence, Dorian, fairly major, and Sandy in
mm,
2012.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
and then, of course, the remnants of hurricanes, Helene being a tropical storm up in western North Carolina, catastrophic damage. But I just thought it was interesting if you think back and just look at it from pure statistics, there has not been a technical landfall of a major hurricane north of Miami in 20 years.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
is kind of
But I
like,
mean, when you if you define Saffir Simpson, if you use Saffir Simpson wind as your definition, I know Hazel is right on the South Carolina North Carolina border. North Carolina's only had one major hurricane landfall since 1900. You know,
right.
and that's why I know we've talked about it before, but that's why I argue we should be using pressure because I don't think you tell people on the Outer Banks they've only had one major hurricane since
Right.
1900. They'd be real happy with that answer. So,
That's
and they've obviously had a lot of 950 to 960 millibar low hurricanes that have caused a lot of damage. And so
yeah,
it's more than just the wind.
that's a story for another committee,
Yeah,
another
exactly.
doing the scale over or getting rid of it, or we need to the Men in Black thing where you, all right, look at this and everybody for
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
now there's a new thing. All right.
Yep.
All right, so that brings me to my next topic. So there have been a lot of Gulf landfalls. Does it just go right back to, well, it's the pattern?
Yeah, I mean, it's we've had I think we've had La Nina La Nina has tended to predominate in recent years, and so that tends to favor storm formations in the Western Atlantic. Um, we've had some years, it's hard, obviously, when you start doing like each year, obviously is very different. Why 2020 had a lot of Gulf storms versus, you know, like 2021 with Ida or something like that. I mean, we just we haven't, for whatever reason, we've just generally had a lot more. The Caribbean has been very conducive the last few years, and we haven't necessarily had as many East Atlantic storms.
Really?
Because in general, East Atlantic, if storms form really far east, those are likely to recurve, maybe scrape the east coast of the U.S. on their way by. If they form closer to the islands, that's where those storms tend to be those are the storms that are obviously really of a lot of concern, because if it's forming near the islands, it's going to hit somebody, whether it's us, the Caribbean,
Yeah.
Central America, someone's going to get it. And so, I mean, we just haven't necessarily had as many East Atlantic storms, but we've had years like 2023 where a lot of stuff formed really far east. So it's hard to lump into exactly, each year has its own climate and each year has its own thing. But I would say in general, the trend towards La Nina is certainly not helping, or certainly is helping if you're looking at if you want lots of Gulf landfalls.
Well,
Uh,
they're starting to really rack up in the Gulf, and people are getting
yeah.
big
I mean,
notice.
you look at Florida 2020. Florida in 2020 managed to pretty much skate by with almost no
Right.
impacts, just some impacts from Ada. But then you look at Louisiana, and Louisiana was getting hit like every 3 or 4 weeks. So, Gulf of Mexico is tricky because the storms that track into the Gulf, we generally have fairly good seasonal forecast skill on. But storms that form in the Gulf itself are hard because they often form from maybe not purely tropical means. It could be fronts early and late.
Right.
But especially La Nina and a really warm Atlantic, that combo is bad for the Gulf because you get these gyre kind of broad circulation
Sure.
setups. And that's what we saw with Helene. Not quite as much with Milton, but
Yeah, Milton was
even
interesting.
Raphael, which thankfully went
Yeah.
into the Gulf and died, but that was kind of that same kind of broad gyre-like setup. And I mean, those anytime you get an area of broad rotation in the Western Caribbean, that's not great for the Gulf of Mexico, because often those storms, the trough will pick them up and take them north. And I mean, obviously Helene to me was kind of a classic case in point of
Yeah.
that kind of formation and that kind of obviously significant impacts.
And the follow-up on the Gulf activity, the amount of rapidly intensifying and our category fives in that region definitely noticeably up. Really short amount of time on a larger time scale, obviously, but it is noticeable. If we go back, I mean, even to 2016, Matthew feels like it kicked off a spate of these because it wasn't since Felix, or was, Felix in 2007 was the last Cat 5 anywhere. And then we had Matthew in 2016 that was briefly a Category 5 in the West Central Caribbean. And then 2017, and now we're getting further out, but we had Irma, and I don't remember what else was a Cat 5 in 17. Maria was close, or did it? And
Maria
then
was a Cat 5. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
right. And 2018, we had Michael as a Cat 5 in the Gulf. 2019, we had Dorian out there. 2020, did 2021 take the year off finally for Cat 5s? I think it did.
Yes.
Close though with Ida. I mean, that was
Yeah,
close.
yeah,
But
yeah.
there's
So
been
I
a
mean,
lot of Category 5s, and you
yeah,
can't say, well, we have better satellite detection because these were like Cat 5s, like recon.
yeah.
Bam.
There's not a question with like you look at like a Milton. There wasn't a lot of it
Right,
wasn't a marginal Cat 5.
right,
It wasn't like Michael where it was like upgraded after the season to Cat 5.
right.
Milton was a high end Category 5, and I mean yeah, I mean overall with a warmer Gulf, it just tends to load the dice. And again, I think really the area that we've generally had very warm Caribbeans the last few years, and when you combine that with a La Nina, you have these extremely low shear, super warm environments. That's going to tend to favor stuff, and especially you know as you get later in the season, you tend to get more atmospheric instability.
Yeah,
And so you can get these, they won't necessarily be around for a long time. You look at like Milton that was only around for a few days, but these storms can just go, and especially with these small storms, they form. I mean, Milton went from tropical depression to a Cat 5 in 2 days. So I mean, that's
yeah.
there's rapid intensification, and then there's that. That's
Right.
like
I still can't believe that I saw that happen with
yeah,
my own
that's like
eyes.
Felix.
Like,
That
right,
Felix or Wilma. That's that kind of thing. And I mean, obviously with Milton, a few days prior, the models weren't even very consistent if that thing was even going to form,
yes.
and suddenly
Oh,
it's a
I
Cat
remember,
5
right.
hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. So,
Yeah,
I mean, and obviously, thankfully, that shear came and slammed it right before it came on shore, but still, definitely very significant impacts. And
yes.
unfortunately, that same strong shear that weakened the hurricane was fantastic for forming tornadoes. So,
Right, right.
so you,
Yeah.
you
Try
get,
dodging that when you're down there doing what I'm trying to do. It's like, whoa, like, and it's funny because I said on my morning update, this is one of the ones where I whiffed it. I was like, oh, these tornadoes typically aren't like the ones that you see in the Midwest. And it was like 3 hours later, that thing. And it was
yeah,
like, bam, big wedge
yeah,
tornadoes
yeah.
going. I was like, whoops.
Yeah, and I mean that's hard. I mean, people asked about it, and I said like we have both that same really strong shear that tanked the that really torched the hurricane. That's obviously good for tornadoes, and also I think really the time of day when it came on shore was bad too because the eastern Florida had sun all morning, so you had
Yeah.
all this. Basically, you just had a highly unstable air atmosphere with a ton of shear, and then those outer rain bands came on shore, and they just like you said. I mean, they were like wedge tornadoes, like
Yes.
Midwest
It
style,
was
not
unreal.
not not typical ropes that you expect to see. So
Right.
but yeah, I
And
mean, a
long
day ahead
lasting
of time, I
too.
wouldn't have anticipated that either. And I think
Right.
challenge with it too was the track of the storm was really good, but the timing of when it was actually going to come on shore was a little unclear, like the exact speed of it.
I
And
remember.
so that I think that I think was one of the reasons why I think it was hard to really anticipate just how strong those,
Right.
because obviously had Milton come on shore, had it been 6 hours later or 6 hours earlier, maybe those tornadoes, because it would have had the shear, but not as much of the instability.
Sure. Interesting point. So my last question and topic here, this is the one that I really, and I've even mentioned it in some of my more recent YouTube updates, and I cannot wait to ask Dr. Klotzbach about this. Are we sort of stuck, for the lack of a better word, in this pattern where the Atlantic is markedly warmer? I mean, it has been these last several years. We're just there. And now it's just, okay, what's the INSO going to be? That kind of dictates things, even though in 2023 that was weird. But it just seems like you look out there now, and it might not be your classic AMO, but you look at the Atlantic, I use the coral reef. We used to be the NOAA
Mm.
Nestis, whatever. It's my go-to. And it's just very evident. You still have all that warm water, and now we have this almost basin-wide La Nina. But are we just kind of in this pattern? Is there any research into that? Like, the climate models can only do so much. When is it going to get cold again? And I don't mean like a flip back to the cold AMO, but it's just permanently warm. What's
I mean,
happening?
we need to get rid of it. We haven't had a really robust subtropical ridge. So if we go back to February of last year, so February 2023, and you look at the Atlantic, SSTs in the basin were pretty much near average. So we kind of shedded some of the warmth from 2022, and then the subtropical ridge in March of 2023 just collapsed, and we had basically no winds. You look at a buoy at 20 north, 40 west, and it was like light and variable. Like there were no
Mm,
trades, so we just had no we just had very little, you know, oceanic mixing. So just the ocean warmed super quickly, and 2023, even though we had a strong El Nino, we still managed to pull off an above normal hurricane season with 20 storms because the Atlantic was so dang hot and we didn't get the shear response that you normally get in a strong El Nino. And then this year, the Atlantic is still almost as warm as last year, depending on exactly where you look, even warmer
right.
than last year.
Yeah.
And then we had cool neutral borderline weak La Nina, and obviously we saw how busy it was this year. I mean, really the big question is, can we get any sort of subtropical ridge to rebound for any pronounced amount of time and get some fairly robust trades? Because if you're going to do it, you want to do it, it's going to happen in the winter. That's when your winds are at their strongest. So, if we were to get a month of strong trades, sure, we could get rid of that heat in a hurry. But right now, as you mentioned, I mean, you look at the SST analyses, it's warm out there. It's still much warmer than normal. So,
Right.
until that subtropical ridge rebounds and we get some strong trades, yeah, I mean, hopefully if we have the current sea surface temperature anomalies that we have now, we have those same anomalies or differences from averages in early April. Yeah, I mean, I don't think El Nino is coming back next year. We just had a strong one. We're kind of maybe going to get to weak La Nina this winter, but the odds of going back to El Nino next year are fairly low. So,
Right.
obviously a lot will hinge on exactly what happens to the Atlantic this winter. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of, you can't really predict the strength of the subtropical ridge more than probably 2 to 3 weeks out. So
Sure.
yeah,
Okay.
we got to get some strong trades. So no light and variable at 20 north, 40 west. We want to see some screaming trades.
Yeah, and then we can look at the Hofmuller diagrams there. I like the one from Dr. Ventris. I know there's plenty different tools out there, different private weather model sites, but man, the easterlies in the Pacific right now for the foreseeable future are just screaming. And then you look
Yeah.
across the tropical Atlantic and the zonal flow, it's just not much in the way of
Yeah,
easterlies
there's
through
not much.
Christmas.
And yeah, I mean, and we've had, we didn't, one of the things that the seasonal forecast we didn't anticipate was we thought we were going to be more towards La Nina than we were. This season, we had a ton of subseasonal variability. So I didn't talk about earlier because I don't want to go too far into depth, but like the Matt and Julian oscillation was very
Right.
robust this year. So we had pronounced periods of easterlies and then westerlies. So we weren't able to really get a really strong trade wind surge to get that La Nina. But
Right.
now we have one. I mean, it's
No,
like
yeah.
if you categorize trade wind surges, it's a Cat 5.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's
we're
impressive.
probably going to get a transition over to La Nina, just given how strong. I need to look at the buoy data today to see what it's looking like. But obviously, if we get the La Nina to go kind of full bore and the Atlantic stays relatively warm, anywhere near as warm as it is this year, I mean, is it like 2023 and 2024 have put the warm, you compare it with like 2020 and 2017 and 2005, like those years were warm, but you look at the last 2 years and it's like
Yeah.
warm on another level. But
They really were.
obviously, as we saw this year, warm Atlantic is not the only thing you need. Obviously, we had some other weird stuff that came in during the middle of the season. So, there's warm Atlantic will certainly load the dice towards a busy season, but other stuff has to play ball as well. Because again, obviously at the end of the day, season was hyperactive, had a ton of impacts and a ton of damage, but still not quite as much activity as we and most other groups anticipated.
Yeah, I just wonder, looking out at just the very basics, just a snapshot of the wide global sea surface temperature anomaly map. I mean, today, putting this together on the 9th of December, 2024, the cold pool in the Pacific, when's the last time you looked at it? Like it goes from 90 west all the way over just past almost 150 east.
Yeah,
Cold
yeah.
anomalies, that's getting it. That's wow. And then the
Yeah, it's
Atlantic,
changed a lot in the
hmm,
last couple of weeks. So,
yeah,
but it's a
and
very robust trade wind surge. You can get a
sure,
big shift when you get those really strong trades for a pronounced period of time. And we had that for 2020 to 2022. It was almost wall to wall, just blue. So easterly anomalies across the tropical eastern and central Pacific for, as far as the eye could see. And then it flipped when we got the El Nino, and until recently we've had some trade wind surges, but not a big one till this. So this may really kick us over to La Nina. And I need to now we're wrapping this up, I'll go and check the latest weekly
Right.
ENSO indices with and see kind of what they're saying. But also the buoy data is really interesting to check
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you can see kind of what's going on the subsurface. So you can
yeah.
get a better idea of how robust the upwelling is. But I suspect given what we're seeing in the winds, the upwelling has got to be very robust.
So I just wonder, to wrap this up, that, you look at see what we got, it just seems like it's more of the same, that you could almost make the generalization that, well, 2025 will probably be a busy season, and unless things change, probably more stuff in the Gulf again. Like, I mean, I know it just seems like we're semi-stuck. I won't say stuck, like we're stuck here for decades, but
Yeah.
it
I
just
mean, we
feels
got to
like
get, I
we're in
mean,
this
the winter,
rut.
if you're going to get stuff to go, it really needs to go in the winter. I mean, you can get stuff in the spring, but it would be
Right.
really, it would be nice to see some big signal change in the next 3 or 4 months to really kind of get the Atlantic back to a more normal sea surface temperature configuration. Because, yeah, I mean, if not, if we go to a La Nina and it's cool, neutral La Nina again, and the Atlantic's super warm, you would expect the Western
Why
Atlantic
not?
to be
Right.
busy.
Why wouldn't it be busy? Right.
It
It would.
should be. So
Right.
it's just, but again, a lot can change in the winter. So if we have the
Right.
same conversation early April, maybe the Atlantic will be back to where it was in 2022 or something like that, where it was a lot cooler, of course, 2022. But we haven't had a below normal year in the Atlantic since 2015. I mean, 2018, we had a weak to moderate El Nino, a cold Atlantic, and we still managed to be above normal. So the Atlantic just seems like it wants to spin up storms right now.
It does indeed. Anything that you want to add? Anything y'all are working on at CSU for future predictors? And you said you got that paper that you actually will be working on the missing hurricanes or something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. I mean, it's like the With the Art Thou Hurricane paper. I mean, again, it was a huge surprise to us, and I think to everybody in the seasonal forecast game. And I mean, to me, this season, I've given a lot of talks in the 2024 season in the last 2 to 3 weeks, and I was calling it like the strangest hyperactive season on record because if you look at the overall, if if I knew nothing about the last 6 months and you said, here's the numbers, I'd be like, okay, it was a little bit less than we thought, but pretty good forecast. But then if you showed me how it got
The
there, I'd be like,
distribution,
how,
yeah.
what? So, I think that really was, I think it's really important to learn about the law. And we do have we're going to try to incorporate more climate model forecasts. So right now, with our seasonal forecast, we look at like the average of the climate. So each climate model has like it's average. So it'll be like, oh, but the European Center has like 50 different ensemble members. So instead of just looking at the average, to look at each member to try to help to kind of maybe encapsulate a little better the uncertainty with the forecast. So we have a lot of ways already of approximating uncertainty, but I think that'll be a new way that we're going to try to encapsulate going forward. And the European Center is also launching, I believe, an upgrade of their seasonal forecast model in the next couple of months. So hopefully we'll have that. So we'll have even better forecast from the upgraded model. So that should hopefully help with seasonal forecast in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, and science is always evolving, and sometimes when you are surprised, and it's not a way to dismiss something, like it really is. It's a good thing. Like if you know everything, it becomes boring, and when you get surprised, it's good to be challenged and take it and learn from it, and it makes you
Yeah.
stronger, makes you better.
And I mean, it also really highlights just how, the season is 6 months long and we have our climatology, which, I'm a big climatology guy. Like you, I got my undergrad, got my degree in geography. So like
Right.
maps and climo and all that stuff is
Yeah.
really, really important. But it's also important to realize that, each season is different. And the fact that we still ended up with 11 hurricanes when we were sitting at 4 hurricanes in September 20, like we set the record for most hurricanes September 25th on record. So we went from dead to extremely busy. And, we had the busiest end of season on record, depending on which metric you look at. So it's important to realize that these seasons are 6 months long and, every season is different. And sometimes seasons play out really kind of like we thought. Honestly, 2023 played out fairly like we thought because the
Yeah.
Atlantic we were unclear, but we thought it was going to be a really big East Atlantic season, and it was. Whereas
That
this
was really
year,
impressive. Yeah, to be honest.
2024, we ended up getting fairly close, but there were certainly a lot of surprises
Right, right.
that came along the way. So I think, yes, there's a lot we can learn, and we'll be taking that into account, as best we can for 2025. And our first forecast will come out on Thursday, April 3rd, from the National Tropical Weather Conference. And I'm sure we'll be discussing all this stuff there.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for spending time with us today. We always appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing how things progress. And any papers that get released, you will certainly post about them, and we will share those. Those of us in the rest of the weather communication business out here on social media will make sure that people get a look at that because a lot of hard work goes into it. And I appreciate all of that. I mean, it is decades of research built upon the beginnings of it with the late, great Dr. William Gray. And here you are, all these years later, still kicking butt with it, and we appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mark. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
See you. Bye bye.